Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Stars Like Us. I am your host, Aliza Kelly, and today I am here with someone that I just am so excited and happy and delighted to see. Her name is Mecca Woods. She was actually the seventh guest ever on Stars Like Us. And Mecca, you are now officially the first repeat guest in Stars Like Us history.
Oh my
Yes.
gosh.
And
Wow.
and
Thank you.
and I am so excited because that was a fucking long time ago now. That was April
Yep.
2019. The world was a very different place. But we had met even a year prior to that, I think in
Yeah.
2018. So we've
Right.
been orbiting each other for a really long time. I'm such a huge fan of your work. For those who are not yet familiar with Mecca, I feel bad for you, but I'm excited to introduce you to her now. She's a Sagittarius Sun, an Aquarius Moon, a Leo rising. Mecca Woods is a New York City-based astrologer and author who works to help create a life that people truly want by using their natural born gifts. Her writing and astro guidance has appeared in places like Bustle, Essence, and on TLC. Her books, Astrology for Happiness and Success and the Astrology Journal, are out now, and she is also currently a board member for the International Association of Ethics and Astrology, and that is what we are going to be spending quite a bit of time talking about today. Right before we pressed record, we sort of, the context of stepping into this conversation, we're talking about the geopolitical stage, right? And astrologers, the how astrologers are being asked to navigate that, how astrologers are navigating that, how astrologers should be navigating that. It's very complicated, and the topic of ethics, especially with our Saturn in Aquarius. Saturn remains in Aquarius at the time of this recording at 18 beautiful degrees, feels very apropos. So Mecca, welcome back. It is so lovely to have you here. Thank you so much
Thank,
for joining us.
thank you. Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be back, and I love your work, and I'm just so excited to talk about ethics today.
Me fucking too. Me too. So I want to sort of just offer a few thoughts that I have, and then I'm going to really pass to you and let you share about what this International Association of Ethics and Astrology is doing, the origins of it, the significance of it. Um, as astrologers here, we are navigating in a space that is extremely unregulated. There are these institutional associations, and that you have to take tests to be part of, to become a member of. They're very, they're old guard to us, but still within the greater scheme of what an actual old guard institution is, they're still like old guards for astrologers, which definitely doesn't have the same sort of infrastructural support that, for instance, a medical association would, or a psychotherapy, a psychology association would. So in a lot of ways, astrologers are sort of navigating and are navigating this work without any codes or checkpoints or any way of, or any sort of like guidelines or standards, right?
Right.
So these are things that literally keep me up at night. So when you asked to come back on the show and you shared that you were a board member in this organization, I was so truly overjoyed to hear that something was being created and structured around this very issue. And now, with my rambling aside, I would love to pass to you and just hear about the origin story for this, what it means, what it does, and what we can learn from it today.
Sure. So as you mentioned, I'm currently a board member of the International Association for Ethics and Astrology, IAEA, for short. And it was an organization that was actually started back in 2020. We had folks like Laura Nalbandian, Patricia Walsh, a few other astrologers who are prominent in the field, who got together and kind of had a bit of a town hall meeting around like, what do we do about, informing people in terms of like what kind of like best practices there are in terms of like practicing astrology and working with clients, and how we talk about astrology not only amongst each other but also within the public sphere. Like, how do we make sure that we're representing ourselves as best as possible, and also making sure that astrology is safe, right? So yeah, so I joined the organization, I would say like in like late 2020, early 2021, if my memory serves me. Um, and basically what we've been doing since then is working on like we have a whole list of like ethics guidelines in terms of like um how we should be conducting ourselves as astrologers. So like, for example, one of the first ethical guidelines that we have up on our website is I strive to be of benefit and to do no harm to all with whom I interact, right? So there's about 15 guidelines up there, and it talks about like basically like being respectful of people's boundaries, of their culture, of the fact that they're all autonomous beings, and that we're not the end all be all in terms of like being an astrologer, or being like we're not here to be people's gurus or gods, right? We're also talking about other best practices. So like we have videos, for example, one by which Samuel F. Reynolds did for us, where he's talking about confidentiality and record keeping, right? There's another video up there by Chris Marmolejo, who's talking about like how to avoid ethnocentrism in your astrology practice. There's another one about like transference and boundaries and how to hold grief for clients as well. So basically what we're doing is we're not here to police people or to tell people what to do in terms of like how they're practicing, but to serve as sort of like a standard, in showing people like this is how you can practice astrology in a way that makes people feel seen, that can be fun and engaging and interesting, but also in a way that we're respectful of each other, and that we want to keep people safe as well. And that when it comes to like how astrology is showing up in the public sphere, that we want to make sure that we're representing ourselves as best as possible.
Yeah, I really appreciate that this work is being explored, and that there are conversations surrounding this, because it does, the past few years have been remarkable, remarkable, and a lot of, major unprecedented events that just have been back to back to back to back, right? And we know that astrology thrives during times of social uncertainty, during times of major shifts in on the macro level, on a national level, on an infrastructural level, on a cultural level, when things are in flux, and especially in this era, in this time, and especially here in America, where religiosity is declining, but yet, the need to have answers and guidance, and to find meaning in the chaos really rises to the surface. And even since the last time you were on the show in 2019, if one were to just step outside, what the fuck has happened, right? Like, why is everyone wearing masks now? Like, why are there plexiglass screens everywhere? You, in just a very short amount of time, even the visual experience of moving through a city and being in the world has transformed. And I think that it's happened so fast, that of course there are some astrologers who are practicing prior to 2020 who, just have maybe a little more Saturn on their side, a little bit more time, a little bit more experience, who have seen what has transpired with fluxes in unprecedented events before. But even if you haven't, or even if you have a lot of experience with astrology, still the last few years for every astrologer has been a whirlwind. You know, I know that the
Yeah.
burnout that astrologers have experienced has been profound.
Mhm.
And also a lot of younger, and I don't just mean that in terms of age, but less experienced astrologers who have really started learning about this practice over the past couple of years in response to such loud volumes of change,
Mhm.
have obviously it has increased, and the platforms that information is able to disseminate on has also increased. Back in 2019, which I'm sort of using as my measure of how quickly the world has changed, like TikTok wasn't what TikTok is now. You know, I don't
Right.
even know if people were on it. I think it was like called like Musically or something, and it was a
Right.
karaoke app. Like, it was, a lot has changed in a very short amount of time. And
Mhm.
that with all of that, there's going to inherently be a lot of whiplash. And I guess, you know, the question that I have in this is, how are the ethical principles that are being established within this organization, are they mostly focused on consulting work, or is it also about how one presents themselves when creating social media content?
No, that's a great question. And I would actually say it's both. So the way that we're currently working on, we're working on a lot of like educational materials, and at some point, there will be more, information that we're aiming to put out. Like we're aiming to build it out into like a membership organization where we could like have classes and refer people and things like that. And so when we're, in creating the themes or the topics that we wanted to educate people on, definitely a big chunk of it was about like counseling astrologers and like how to do that in a safe, respectful, ethical way. But then we're also thinking about astrology, like I was mentioning, in terms of the public sphere. So definitely social media being a big part of that. And kind of wanting to educate people in terms of like what, if we are talking about politics, like for example, me and Janelle Belgrave, who's also an astrologer, we have our own podcast, Stars on Fire, where we talk a lot about like politics and astrology through that lens. And, one of the things from, when we talk about like IAEA is that if we're talking about these things, how do we talk about it in an ethical way? How do we talk about like these big events or these global events in a way that is helpful to people and that doesn't feed into things like sensationalism or fear mongering, right? I think for me personally, one of the biggest sort of dilemmas that I've had over the past couple of years is like wanting to be in a space where I'm educating people and keeping people informed about like the various things that are going on in the world, but also wanting to make sure that it doesn't come from a place that is like salacious and clickbaity. You know what I mean? So definitely, a big part of and this is something that we're going to be rolling out soon in terms of like Instagram, and eventually, we'll also be releasing our own set of like TikTok soon, in just terms of like educating people and like, before you go to post about, what's happening in Ukraine or, what's happening, globally or this, that can like think about how the audience is going to receive it, whether or not, you're giving people information that's helpful, or is it just to kind of like drive up views and drive up clicks, because that's when it can get a little bit, dicey.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that it's a backdrop to all of the past few years. Um, and I have been speaking about this for a long time, because looking at the astrology is the temptation to sort of create astrologer god figures, right? And
Mhm.
I guess just to, for lack of a better term, just like this, the cultification, the radicalization that can be done through astrology and other metaphysical practices, which we've already started to see.
Mm-hmm.
2020 into 2021, I had to unfollow dozens of people, many of whom I had previously had as guests on the show.
Mm.
And, you know, Lucy says hi.
Hi,
Maybe those individuals may have skewed at certain points. They would make posts over the years, because I had known them, for a while, and they'd make posts where I was like, it's like, I wouldn't say that, or like, that feels a little bit too, as you're saying, like salacious, or that feels a little bit like it's riling, it's the intention to rile people up in a way that
mm-hmm.
is not how I would want to approach it. But
Right,
the stakes weren't as high.
right, right.
When the stakes suddenly became a public health crisis, and we're talking about, people's lives. And
Mm-hmm.
this is just, this is the public health crisis. This is also just, various, obviously, like, if we're talking about a geopolitical context of like Israel and Palestine, or
Mm-hmm.
Ukraine and Russia, or even just the tension and the polarization within the United States, people, their physical bodies and their mental health and their lives are, these are not casual things that one could be flippant about.
Right,
um,
right.
and I think that over the past few years, the lack of, or the lack of ethics, and then also maybe people being unethical, going
Mm-hmm.
as far as to say that there truly, it seems like there is no moral compass, there are no boundaries, there are no limits to what is going to be said for views, for a following, for to create a toxic dynamic where someone keeps coming back to that person for information because they're not getting it anywhere else. Like, to me,
Right.
it's super scary, it's super alarming, because we're dealing with real people's lives and real
Mm-hmm.
people's mental health and their physical body health and their family's health and their community's health. And I don't just mean because of COVID, I also mean for whatever could come next. You know what I mean?
Right, right. No, I totally agree. And I think that, I have a very strong Saturn in my chart. My Mercury's in Capricorn, and ethics for me has always been something that I've cared very deeply about, because I mean, even before I became a practicing astrologer, I was very apprehensive about like actually like charging money for it, because I was like, well, I don't want to give people bad information. Like, I was very much like, I want to do this the right way. And luckily I was able to like get mentored, and like I was able to grow in this practice. But yeah, I do think that, as astrologers, we have to be mindful of like our responsibility to the public, right? And like I said, like the first guideline, in terms of like IAEA is, we strive to be of benefit and to do no harm. Right, like that's like full stop there. And then from there, I think it's important to also recognize that like the other thing that we've been also thinking about or working on is also like addressing the issue around like the fact that there are multiple techniques and schools of thought when it comes to astrology. Like, astrology is very broad in terms of field and study, specialties, and that as astrologers we also have to recognize like what our limitations are in terms of like what we can speak to as an expert or as an authority in our field, versus the things that we can't, right? So for example, when I think about, for me, I consider myself to be a bit of a generalist when it comes to my practice, but there also are other branches of astrology that I'm very interested in, but I know that I'm not going to counsel or talk too much about it, because I don't have the qualifications or the skills to be able to put forth a educated, expert opinion or take on it. And I think that that's also something too that we've been talking about as well, both within the organization and also outside of it, is like, what happens when it's okay to like be very excited or in terms of learning about these things, and you're talking about that from a standpoint of like I'm really curious about this, and I don't want to. So, for example, like let's say like horary, which I'm always curious about it, but I also feel like I don't know enough. Like I haven't practiced that branch of astrology enough to say like I can start taking horary questions and answering that for people. But I do know astrologers who do that, and here's that person. Like being able to recommend people or refer people out, I think is also a part of practicing ethical astrology. And like I said, like that's the Saturn piece, like recognizing what your limitations are, and not being okay, because we're not going to be able to do every single thing, and we shouldn't, because we should have people who are specialized and trained in certain areas, and who are good at that. And then we also have people who are good at other things too. So that's another thing that's been coming up for us too.
Yeah, and I think that, that's so meaningful, because even in the past few hours, the barrage of questions that I've had asking to speak to the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, if you will, is I can't. I
Right.
can't. I have been studying the United States chart for a long time, and
Mm-hmm.
I can speak to domestic matters. I can't speak to all of them, but I can I feel like I have a better understanding of looking at that Sibley chart. I've
Mm-hmm.
worked with it for
Right.
a long time. I have familiarized myself enough with the mundane techniques to be able to say, okay, on a domestic level, here are some things that we might want to keep an eye on. Internationally,
Mm-hmm.
no, it doesn't translate.
Right.
You can,
Right.
and this, I have never pulled up the Ukrainian birth chart in my entire life,
Mm.
so suddenly it's like, but with social media, and then with certain people, and when I say certain people, I'm not like saying certain people wink wink, I'm just saying with people being like, oh, you can apply the same techniques to the Ukrainian chart that you can to this practice, to your consulting practices, and these mean the same thing, and I can make these broad sweeping generalizations about how one thing informs another and finding the patterns. But it's like, if you're pulling up the chart of Ukraine for the very first time and making huge sweeping statements about what is going on in that country that you have not spent any time in, that you don't know anything about, that you have literally no familiarity with whatsoever, to me, it's unethical. And
Mm-hmm.
we're in this moment of, where this is like, this is happening as we speak at the time of this recording, and this will be released soon, so it'll still be very topical. But it's in these moments that I feel very stressed out, to be honest, and
Mm-hmm.
very grateful that to know that there are other astrologers out there who are also like, uh-oh, we have a problem here, because the implications of it compound.
Mm-hmm.
Not
Mm-hmm.
only does it do harm to, even if it's like a little 13-year-old in Indiana, it's still, that information becomes misinformation, and
Mm-hmm.
what is the line there? And also recognizing that every astrologer is a human, and every human has their own biases, and every human
Mm-hmm.
has their
Mm-hmm.
own, and whether that is malicious or not, they have their own agenda, and they're going to be interpreting everything through that lens, that
Right.
nothing is like one size fits all. I know I
Right.
just went on a total tangent, but
No, no,
it's
no. No, I think that that's an important piece that you just raised there, because that actually, in the work that we're doing at IAEA, we also are taking trainings too, right? So we're not just like saying like, okay, this is what you guys need to do, and we're not doing any of the work ourselves. Like, we just had a training recently that had to do with like inherent biases, and like talking about like how that can sneak up on you, in terms of like consultations, or the kind of astrology that you're talking about, and like how to like spot and recognize, and like what to do about it when it shows up, so that we don't make those kinds of mistakes, so that we don't fall into those traps where, like I said, we're putting ourselves in positions where we can be disrespectful or harmful to other people, based on, their identity or their culture or their background, or even cultural issues that are super sensitive, right? So, for example, I think about like the George Floyd situation that happened, and how that was a very hot button topic. And of course, there were a lot of astrologers who were talking about that, but some of them didn't have the quite, the same sensitivity, I think, that a lot of us wanted them to have, where it pertained to like talking about this and saying like, hey, this was a real person, and there are like people who continue to be affected by these kinds of discriminatory laws, and we're living this life, especially as we get, in terms of like Black Americans, like we live this life where that threat of violence is very real and very scary, right? And if someone is doing a talk about it, we would hope that that person would be able to talk about it from a place of not only um, sort of like this is what happened and this is what's going on and this is the astrology of it, but also doing it from a place of like sensitivity and compassion too, right? So, these definitely are big things that are going on, and what this organization, why I joined this organization in terms of like wanting to kind of turn some things around, and also letting people know that, hey, there are astrologers out here who do care about the way that this art is being practiced, and we want to make sure that people can come from different spaces and ideas, and be able to share that, but be able to do it in a way that is safe, that's ethical, where people feel seen and understood. Even thinking about too, another thing that we've been talking about is like some of like the public infighting, between astrologers, and how that's been coming up a lot. And granted, not everybody is going to be on the same page. And we know that, astrologers are going to disagree. But when it becomes a thing where it becomes almost like you said, like a kind of culty, where people can almost like set their followers onto another person, and it becomes sort of like, like bullying and things like that. And that's where, it's
Right. We've
a lot.
derailed so far from
Yeah.
the value of astrology,
Right,
like
right,
when
right,
we get into those territories.
right.
Yeah. And, I early on in my practice started to, and actually it's interesting that to talk about the financial aspect of things, because I think we should spend a few minutes talking about that for listeners too, because I know that especially for someone who's trying to figure out how, I'm setting my prices for the first time, how much should I charge, what is appropriate, what isn't appropriate. When I first started to work with strangers, and I was charging a very low entry point, like maybe it was $20 for 30 minutes or 45 minutes or even an hour. It was, because I was just getting, I was scared of, I have my North Node is an Aquarius in the first house, like what else can I say? I'm very
Right.
conscientious of, I want to give someone what they pay for. And if I'm still young and I'm still green and I'm still figuring out how to be a consulting astrologer, I don't want to overcharge. But what I
Right.
started to notice is when they were that low, I would also get people who would come in with a lot of desperation. And the questions that were asked were really high stakes, really desperate situations. And this would happen a lot, especially at events or where someone wasn't paying for the reading. And it was like, these offerings, these really sort of like just very sort of transactional, doesn't take a big investment on the client's part, financial investment. And the questions that I was being presented with, and this was early in my practice, we were like, when am I going to see my daughter again? What are the lottery numbers? When am I going to win the lottery? What is going to happen? Like, how am I going to get out of this legal situation. And very quickly, I realized that this isn't going to work. I cannot advise on any of these matters. I don't want to advise on any of these matters. And to start establishing boundaries, creating sort of a more structured approach to my readings, getting the Acuity software in, having a schedule, making it so that people couldn't do an immediate turnaround, so that they had to wait a certain number of weeks before they actually had the session. We're able to help filter out some of those like instant impulse, knee-jerk reasons to want to talk to a practitioner, which was really helpful. But also, I learned firsthand early on that this doesn't make me feel comfortable. I don't feel safe doing this. I don't feel like I as a practitioner don't feel safe doing it. And I also don't feel like I would be able to offer any real advice to these people who really need a different type of expertise in order to navigate these situations. And fortunately, at that time, fortunately or unfortunately or whatever, like at that time, astrology was in a different space. It was not as ubiquitous. So it was, and there weren't apps where you could go and set up a practitioner profile and get booked, like, with the fast turnaround like that. So me creating this very, Capricorn rising boundary, like you book a session, you have it in the X number of weeks, so that by the time you actually are talking to me, hopefully whatever, any escalated situations, you're not in a crisis, at the time that we're talking. But now, because astrology is so ubiquitous, there are so many astrologers, and there are these pieces of technology where you can, book a session with someone and then have it that same minute so fast, and there are these apps that support it. I fear that astrologers are also leaning into the crisis, leaning into the desperation, which is, to me, just like so scary and so unsafe for everyone involved.
Yeah, no, I think that's that's worth like bringing up, because I do think about, like, for example, even like with my own practice, I too, like when I first started out, I didn't really charge very much for my readings or sessions either, because I was still learning and I still wanted to make sure that um what I was charging was relative to the expertise that I was able to offer at the time. And of course, as I continued to study and grow, my prices went up as a result of that. And when I think about like how, I also created a system too where people have to go through the website and they have to book, and there's a certain amount of time that they can wait. And I also, like, even with clients who are repeat, I'm like, please don't come see me anytime soon. Like, I'll see you next year, I'll see you maybe 6 months from now, but like, we're not going to do a thing where like every every time you have a question or are feeling anxious about something, like we're not on call, basically, right? And yeah, and so definitely I think that as astrologers, we also have to be mindful of that too, of the fact that, yeah, a lot of people right now are very much in a place of uncertainty. People are very anxious. People are kind of going through it right now. I mean, even as an astrologer, I'm still kind of going through it myself. Like, we're not exempt, from the things that are currently going on. And I think it makes a lot of sense that we have to be mindful in making sure that we're not feeding the frenzy, or feeding the fear, feeding that beast, so to speak, by making sure that, like, for example, on the intake that I do for clients when they're first booking with me, one of the questions I ask is like, why are you getting this reading? Take a moment to really think about why you're getting this reading, so that when we get to session, you have a clear understanding and expectation of what you're going to get from it. And I do too, right? And that's another thing when we talk about like ethics, managing client expectations is a big part of that, making sure that they know that, again, we're not here to be the end all and be all in terms of like what goes on in their life and what doesn't. We're just opening up a window for them, right? And providing a lens or a framework in terms of like what's going on for them, why it might be going on and what they can do about it, right? And presenting some options, or some guidelines in terms of like how they might be able to navigate whatever period of life that they're in at the moment. But we also, as astrologers, respect the fact that they are autonomous, sentient beings who are here with their own stuff, doing their own thing, their own lived experiences, and that they can choose to take the advice that we offer or they not. Either way, like we're not here to put ourselves in any sort of like bigger position in terms of what we already are. And definitely I think, like, to your point, what you were saying about like making sure that we're not like kind of feeding into that, I think is also a part of like what it means to practice astrology ethically.
Yeah, I think that I'm really so comforted to hear you share these sentiments, because I think perhaps one of the needs for this organization is that I didn't know, I've been scared, Mecca. I've been scared. I didn't know. I was like, I'm freaking out over here because I see so much room for really unethical, really manipulative behavior. And I
Mm-hmm.
see people
Mm-hmm.
doing it,
Right.
and
Right.
I don't want to, be the weird whistleblower like out there, yeah, by myself, so like I'm
Mm-hmm.
also like, what do I say, what do I do, all I
Right.
know is what my moral compass is and what my ethical code is. And I am grateful to feel like I have a pretty solid, strong foundation. But obviously I want to keep learning. I want to
Mm-hmm.
keep um, understanding what it means to have, not just the responsibility of an astrologer, but the responsibility of a platform, and a
Mm-hmm.
responsibility of an astrologer with a platform that then um, people listen to. And if people are taking the words that I'm saying so seriously, or the guests that come onto the show, or the information that I'm sharing, there are so many consequences, and
Mm-hmm.
it can feel like a lot. But one of the things that I do, and I guess this is for any listener out there, is before I post something, I do a check with myself and say, well, am I nervous about posting this? Is
Right.
this something that is there a potential that this could be misinterpreted or
Mm-hmm.
misconstrued? And if there is, I don't fucking post it, because
Right.
I don't want that because the stakes are too high. And I also know that I don't know everything. And I
Right.
know that I don't want to speak and from a place of my own bias, my own prejudice, my own unique vantage of seeing the world, and then apply that on a macro scale to
Right.
anyone who's looking at my content, or to an individual who I'm in dialogue with in a session, because the
Right.
power dynamics of that are really off balance,
Right. Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that, that makes me think about how sometimes, as astrologers, we love to talk about our charts, right? And we also love to sometimes like get on social media and talk about like certain placements, like, oh, if you have an Aquarius moon, you might feel this way, or if you have, a Venus Pluto, you might approach relationships that way. And it's sometimes, it's fun and it's interesting, to talk about that pieces of our chart. But I also think it can also lead us into dangerous territory where we isolate certain parts of our chart, um, and without really any context, and kind of paint like sort of like a blanket sort of, statement over it, especially if it's something like kind of like negative, you know what I mean? Like I've seen, people who like I've had clients who have come to me who have been like, yeah, I don't know why they always dump on Capricorns, or I have a Scorpio moon and like we'll talk about it and they'll be like cringing, like, yeah, I know. And I'm like, it's okay. Like,
Yeah, it's
you have a moon
beautiful.
in Scorpio, like it's
Yeah.
all good. You know what I mean? Like, and so I've been finding myself as an astrologer at times, like having to do a bit of damage control with folks, who come to me because they've maybe had another reading, or maybe they've seen certain things on social media or read things, and we're like, oh my goodness, this something is wrong with my chart. And it's like, no, that's just one, one interpretation, but this could also mean this and that. And also like the language, is a big deal too. Like when we start talking about ethics as well, in terms of like, how do we speak about things in a way that's accurate, but also leaving things open enough where a person can recognize like this can be true, but this can also be true as well. Like it doesn't have to necessarily mean that like, if you're born with Saturn in the seventh, you're going to be lonely for the rest of your life. You know
Right.
what I mean? Like, stuff like that. So yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And I think then that also, and I heard you refer earlier to astrology as an art. Um, and I also refer to it as an art. And I distinctly don't refer to it as a science because I
Right.
don't think it's a science.
No, it's not.
It, and I think that it's really important to recognize what astrology can do and what astrology can't do. And it
Mhm.
doesn't make astrology any less meaningful, effective, powerful. We've both been consulting astrologers who I know have seen the beautiful metamorphosis that people can go through when they start to really live their truth through their chart. And
Mhm.
that the efficacy of astrology as an art, as a tool for self-empowerment, self-actualization is monumental, but it is not a science, and it is not exact. And there's a lot of room for it's only room for interpretation. It's an interpretive language, which means that
Mhm.
it also gives us, we have the ability um, to move with time, to say maybe we no longer need to gender these planets in the same way, or maybe we no longer need to refer to malefics and benefics in the same way that we did in the past, because there's room for fluidity, and there's room for discourse, and there's room for discussion around it. But at the same time, there's obviously a canon, and there's obviously like a tradition, and there are certain associations. And I do think that marrying those is really interesting and poetic and lovely and beautiful. But I do find that perhaps it is because of, people people like to be right, and on social media,
Mhm.
people want to be the really right. They want to
Mhm.
be the one to like hit the prediction. They want to be the one to drop the esoteric fact about something and then devalue all of the other things. But I think that in a way that actually, I mean, it deters me from wanting to participate in that exchange at all, because that's so not what I see the value of astrology being.
Right, right. No, I agree. And I think that to the point that you had brought up about like whether or not you post certain things, I feel like I've definitely more and more, especially over the past couple of years, have been adopting that. I mean, I already fret over every little thing that I put out anyway, just because I have a Mercury retrograde in Capricorn, and I'm always like, like I'm always like super like worried about how it's gonna land. But yeah, I think that yeah, like with the popularity of astrology, everybody wants to be first, everybody wants to be right, everybody wants to have like the best take or the only take on things. And that also creates situations because we also have history of people borrowing or stealing other people's content in order to do that, like yeah, I think right now the big thing that I've been trying to, I guess, encourage people to do, especially like the more of like the up and coming astrologers, is to kind of like take their time and not feel pressured to have to like know everything. It's impossible anyway. Like one of the reasons why I gravitated to astrology was because it's such a big field, and I know that there was always going to be something that I was going to learn, always something new. And I've been doing this, for a decade at this point, right? And still, there's stuff that I'm like, wow, I didn't know that, wow, this is amazing. And I think for me in doing this work, not only just in terms of like the ethics piece, but also just like being an astrologer and like the growth that I've had, I've also kind of had to learn myself where it was okay for me not to have to like have a take on something or talk about certain things or rush to post. It's just like it's okay if you're not in it. It's okay if you're not discussing. It's all right. Like talk about the things that you know how to talk about. And, as long as you do that as best as you can, that's all that anyone can really ask about of you,
Yes.
and the people, the right people, the audience will find you, like you don't
Right.
have to try to be everything to everyone, or, just like become like a content mill or anything like that. Like it's okay. Like easy does it.
Yeah. I also, like, I think a great example of this is at the time of this recording, again, this is the week of some exactitudes with the US Pluto return.
Hmm.
And what I was explaining earlier this week to some people is that, like, nobody fucking knows. You literally can't know what it means because it's never happened. It hasn't, there's no precedent, And when the United States in 1776, Pluto didn't even exist, from in our perception. It wasn't discovered until 1930. So it's not even 100 years old as a archetype that has been incorporated into the language. So any application of the United States as Pluto return is really just looking at other, it's looking retroactively at what has happened with other countries, what has happened with other nations,
Right.
what has this looked like in the past, but it's all just speculation.
Hmm.
It's pure speculation because unlike unlike something like Saturn, which is a 30-year orbit where you could be like, okay, here's a pattern, here's a cycle. There can be some, astrologers love to find the pattern. So like we can do some good pattern mapping with
Right.
Pluto, with something like Pluto or even Neptune. It's like these orbits are so big, they're so wide, they're so long that
Mm.
speaking of like, well, this is what it means for the United States of America is silly. It's silly
Right.
to say that with conviction. You can say, here are, it could look like this. It could be, this is what Pluto represents. It's in the second house. What could that mean? What are the things that are going on? But genuinely, we don't know. Astrologers couldn't know. And I think
Mm.
that the sort of, and that's when you got in, when you mentioned sort of like the deification of astrologers, I think that that's where it really gets to be a slippery slope, where
Hmm.
astrologers
Hmm.
present themselves as having future knowing, you know, fucking Nostradamus shit to be able to like say, I have the foresight to be able to see these events upcoming. That to me is just like it's so inappropriate. It's so out of bounds.
Yeah, I agree. I think that like when we talk about future events, the best in my opinion, I feel like the best way that we can talk about is like the way that things can or possibly transpire. But I think it's important to be very careful by saying like this will, or like, or being too fatalistic about certain things, and kind of taking people's agency, away. Because yeah, once we start like veering into the space of like absolutes, it gets like, as I'm just thinking, like as a person who is listening to that or getting a reading or things like that, it can just feel very like, okay, well, what is the point then? Like what is the point? What am I doing then? Right. And I think that, as astrologers, I think it's important that we're not blowing smoke up people's asses for sure, right? That we're not saying that everything is going to be hunky-dory and no one's going to have any problems and everything's just going to be peace on earth. But I also think we shouldn't veer into the opposite, right? The extreme of that, and just be like, it's all bad, no good can come from this, or, things like that. But present something that's somewhere in the middle.
Right. I think that to the best of our ability, I mean, especially when we're working with clients, to really be present, to be engaged, to understand, what does this person who's coming to me want? What are they looking to receive insight or clarification on? And to illuminate and offer practical solutions based on one's level of expertise that are going to be advantageous. And so that a person walks away from a session feeling empowered and uplifted, even if it is, even if they're going through a difficult time, that they're still, you know, we're focusing more on like when that cycle is going to end than we're focusing on what fucked up things could happen when they're there, you know? Like I think it's really important for people to know that everything is in flow, and to know that we're always in cycles, and to know that, you know, even a really scary time is always in astrology followed by a very different house, a very different theme, a very different energy, the different sign, you know? But and I relate to what you had said about doing damage control in your own sessions, where like I'll talk to people who are like, I had an astrologer tell me that Uranus in my 8th house means that my whole family's going to die. And it's like, it's going to be there for 10 years, you know, like it's a long time, you know, is it going to be over the whole decade that you have this giant 8th house that Uranus is going to be going through, or what?
Right. Exactly. Yep. Yeah, I agree. I agree. Yeah. No, I think that, you know, when I think about, you know, the way in which we're practicing, it's, yeah, like we have to also be mindful that, you know, sometimes there could be things that come up for people too, that they may not even be ready to talk about.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? And that we have to be respectful of that and not try to push or prod someone into a area that they may really be triggered or uncomfortable with, right?
Yes.
And just because you can see something in the chart doesn't necessarily mean that that person might want that information, right? And that doesn't mean to say that they'll never come to that, but as an astrologer, you also have to recognize like when a person is ready for something and when they're not, and being respectful of that. And again, it kind of boils back to the fact that like we're not the end all be all. You know, they're a sentient, autonomous beings. It's not our job to fix them. And I love, you know, like Jessica Liato had a podcast about this recently, and she was talking about that as well. Just like, you know, you have to respect the person's path, pretty much. You know, like this is their path. You know, they're going to have some stuff going on in their path, but it's not our job as astrologers to try to like save them or even, you know, point them in a direction that they may not be ready to go.
Yeah, so, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that what that also makes me think about is, you know, when working with someone, and depending on whether you're doing an in-person session or a Zoom session or a phone session, not everyone is going to have the same level of sensitivity embedded into them to know when someone seems apprehensive, in which case we need then spaces like it sounds like what this organization is endeavoring to do, where trauma-informed experts can help astrologers learn that skill. Because learning the skills of astrology, learning what planets equal what and how to do a horoscope delineation has nothing to do with sitting with someone and being, you know, a consulting astrologer. When it comes down to like how you're actually showing up in that dialogue, you're also working with not just the planets, you're working with a real person and their real past and their real mental health and their real situations and stakes involved. And I know that ESAR has some ethics classes that are baked into the membership. But I think that it's like a certain number of hours that you have to do. I mean, it's also who's teaching those classes, you know, like it also needs, we need to be listening to a variety of different people who, so that we have the representation to know what works with some people is not going to be able to work for others. And it's not a one-to-one. You can't just transfer it.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree. And that definitely is something that we're doing with IAEA. Like we definitely want to be mindful of the fact of like there's a need for diversity.
Yes.
We definitely want to make sure that when we talk about things like trauma, in fact, that's going to be some of the upcoming like videos that we're going to be releasing soon to be talking about that. So we have a couple of videos up that are up on the website now that people can go and check out if they want to know a little bit more about certain ethical issues that show up within consultation. Eventually, we would like to put out some more stuff that will be more for like the general public as well, in terms of like how to find an astrologer, and what to do if you're in an astrology reading and you feel uncomfortable, and things of that nature. But we are in, we're talking about some things where it's like, if you are not skilled, again, kind of goes back to what we're saying, like if you're not skilled in certain areas, it's probably best to steer clear from it. So like, talking about, trauma, or trying to unpack someone's trauma in their chart, and you're not really skilled in their area, you can really end up like harming a person and really opening up a landmine. I'll never forget when I first was learning how to do read a chart, and Rebecca Gordon, who is a great friend of mine, who was actually my mentor at the time, she was having me read it, for her practicing, like, okay, pretend I'm the client, give me a reading, like, let me see what you're doing. And I was giving her the, and my Mercury in Capricorn was like, okay, well, here are all the problems. And she was like, okay, but I'm pretty sure they kind of have an idea of what the problems are if they're coming to you. How are you going to get them out of that? Like, how are you going to show them a way out of those problems? Like, we can't just zero in on that. We have to be able to give them something, or talk about things that are like solution based, or prescriptive in some way that are going to help people with dealing with these problems or handling these problems. And on there, and that really was like an eye opener for me in terms of like reading a chart. It's like, yeah, you can't just lead a person into this really dark space and open up all this stuff and not have like a good way to be able to kind of like get out of that.
Yes.
So yeah, these definitely are all things that we're talking about within the organization, and we're going to be, like I said, putting out more videos and content on socials and on the website, to definitely like educate people on this stuff.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Mecca. So where can we find you? And then where can we find the website where we can start accessing the videos and we can see what's coming up next?
Sure. So you can find me at my website, mylifecreated.com. And you can, find all my info there on my books and my socials, and, what I got going on next. As far as the International Association of Ethics in Astrology, you can find us at ethicalastrologers.org.
Thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure, such an illuminating conversation. I so appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lisa. I love you.
Love you.